Executive Vice President of Special Projects at the Pew Research Center, where he oversees demographic, social, and generational research. He's the author of The Next America. Some of you have that book. Thanks for carpooling. From 1996 through 2003, he served as president and board chairman of the Alliance for Better Campaigns. And before that, he was a newspaper reporter for 25 years, the last 14 at the Washington Post, where he covered national politics and served as a foreign correspondent. From 1992 to 95, he was the Post bureau chief in South Africa and reported on the historic transformation from apartheid to democracy there. So without further ado, our guest, Paul Taylor.
Thank you, Terrence. Thank you all for braving the weather. I'm on a little mini book tour. Yesterday I was in Seattle. It wasn't raining in Seattle. I'm going to give you, I'm going to try to be quick. My wife, Stephanie, is here. She's heard all this stuff before. She starts to roll her eyes, so she'll speed me up. But I'll try to be fairly quick. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, and I hope we'll have time for questions, or maybe I'll just stop and we'll all run for cover. The book is about generational change, about demographic change and generational equity. Demographic change is a drama in slow motion. It unfolds sort of incrementally, tick by tick, but it transforms societies in fundamental ways. And the United States today is undergoing two such dramas simultaneously. We are on path to becoming a majority non-white country. At the same time, a record share of us are going gray. Either of these changes would be the defining demographic story of its era. The fact that both are happening at the same time it has created some generation gaps that have the potential to threaten and put stress on everything from our families to our pocketbooks to our politics to our entitlement programs to our social cohesion. Because we're at a moment now where, because of these changes, young and old in America don't look alike, don't think alike, and don't vote alike, and it is they who are going to have to sort of figure out some of the demographically inspired challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century. So one of the paradoxes of demographic change is that even though it does happen all around us, it's sometimes hard to see because nobody calls a press conference, nobody does a drum roll and says, look, we're changing. But occasionally aha moments come along where the scales lift from our eyes and we can sort of see the change. And this aha moment that I'll describe happened too late to be in the book. It happened just a few months ago. Had the book been timed differently, I think I would have led the book with it. But it was Super Bowl 3 months ago, beginning of February, and and among other things, the Super Bowl has become the Super Bowl of advertising. And all the big product advertisers spend a lot of money to roll out their new messages. And we, as consumers of advertising messages, have been seeing TV ad families all our lives, and we sort of know what a TV ad family looks like. Among other things, the parents in a TV ad family tend to be the same race and the opposite sex. That's generally been the rules. So if you think about three of our most iconic consumer brands, Chevy, Coke, and Cheerios, they all rolled out ads on the same Super Bowl 3 months ago, and they sort of broke the rules. And there's a Chevy ad that, they're selling cars, and they're selling cars to families, and the theme of the ad was, look, we all have families in America, but what it means to be a family has changed in America, and here's the new us. And we saw a montage of families that included same-sex parents and opposite-race parents in doing what families do, driving their cars and being happy. Cheerios had its ad, and Cheerios 6 months before had come out with an ad that had a white woman and a black man and their mocha-colored daughter, and there was a lovely little TV ad exchange about Cheerios being good for the heart. When that ad ran in the middle of last year, it got so much blowback on YouTube and other things, and the comment stream got so ugly that they pulled it down. But then they came back 6 months later on the Super Bowl with sort of the second installment of that ad. In effect, they said, look, we're ready for this. This is the new America. Here we are. And then finally, Coca-Cola had an ad that featured a montage of people singing America the Beautiful in 6 different languages. And they were the many nationalities of who we are. Well, All of those ads predictably got some blowback. There were some ugly comments in the Twitter sphere and in some of the precincts of the media. And, it got me to thinking, product advertisers certainly are not in the business of making political statements, and they're certainly not in the business of making enemies. They're spending $4 million for that 30 seconds, and they don't want to antagonize people, and they surely knew that they would have some reaction. But here's what else they also knew. They look at the sort of the numbers that the Census Bureau puts out. They look at the numbers that organizations like mine put out, and we do a lot of public attitudes, and we do a lot of demographic and economic data. And they looked all around them, and what they see is an America that is changing profoundly. And to start with race, in 1960, the population in the United States was 85% white. By 2060, the population in the United States will be 43% white. Now, when I say this in most places around the country, that very statistic alone sort of shocks people. My guess is it doesn't shock people here in California because you are the future, you are living it, you are seeing it. And you also know what is driving that change. And what's driving that change is our modern immigration wave. This is the third great immigration wave in our history. The first began in the mid-19th century, is mostly Northern and Western Europe. The second is in the early 20th century, is mostly Southern and Eastern Europe. Those two immigration waves combined brought about 32 million people to this country, 90% of them from Europe. The modern immigration wave begins in 1965 when we open up our borders again, having closed them in reaction to those first two waves. All immigration waves in our history produce backlashes, social, political, and economic. And in the 1920s, America had enough with all those immigrants, and we kind of shut it off for 30 or 40 years. Opened it back up in 1965. Since then, more than 40 million immigrants have come. So more than the first two waves combined, although as a share of the population, not as big. And of course, they're not, only 12% are coming from Europe. So in the modern immigration wave, about half are from Latin America, nearly 3 in 10 from Asia, although in the last 3 or 4 years, actually the Asian immigration wave, annual immigration has surpassed Hispanics. So in addition to doing what immigration waves always do, which is replenish ourselves, which is make us younger, which is bring workers in, it is changing our racial and ethnic complexion in a very dramatic way. Immigrants, although these immigrants are coming from different parts of the world, they share tendencies that all immigrants have. They're strivers, they believe in the future, they're optimists, they tend to have a lot of kids. And so it's not just the immigrants who are changing our complexion. It is the fact now this immigration wave is, as I say, 30 or 40, 50 years old. There's now a second generation of U.S.-born children of these immigrants who are moving into the workforce, moving into the electorate, and who are very much a part of our future. And again, in California, half of all children today are children of immigrants. This is the state with the highest number of children of immigrants. Half of all children today are children of immigrants. In New York, in Texas, and in Florida, about a third are children of immigrants. Immigrants have a lot of kids. This is part of our future. The last thing I'll say about the racial and ethnic change is that the categories I've described, so we're 43% white by 2060, we'll be about 30% Hispanic. Again, these are projections. They may be off by a few percentage points, things change, but they're basically built on mortality, on fertility, and on immigration trends. 30% Hispanic, 9 or 10% Asian, 13% black, and then a growing share other. One of the interesting questions to ask ourselves as we go down decades from now is whether these racial classifications will still make much sense. Because today, about 15 or 16% of all new marriages are across racial and ethnic lines. If you go back 50 or 60 years, that was almost unheard of. Barack Obama's parents were married in 1961 in Hawaii. Our best estimate is that 0.1% of marriages then was between a black person and a white person. It was still illegal in much of the country. It was a gasp-inducing taboo everywhere else. Today, led by young adults who have a much more porous sense and a much more tolerant sense of racial attitudes, people are marrying across racial lines and ethnic lines. This again is led by Hispanics and Asians, more than a quarter of whom marry out, and most of them marry whites. So these parents are going to have kids. They're having kids. What do we call these kids? We now see them in TV ads. If you do an A-list of celebrities, many of our celebrities are mixed race. You know, being mixed race through most of human history has been very difficult, often rejected by the two bloodlines that you came from. Barack Obama sometimes describes himself as a mutt. He had but the question is, how do we think of these folks? What do they call themselves? What will we call them? And it's a drama that will, I think in the best sense of the word, challenge us. Obama had to fill out his census form like everybody else in 2010. He could have said he was white. He could have said he was black. He could have said he was both white and black. He chose to say, I'm black, and he got a little blowback, actually, because there is a mixed race community that is encouraging people who come from different bloodlines and streams to, listen, declare all of who you are. Why not just a part of who you are? And Obama's response was, you know, look, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing, you got a name like Barack Obama, you look like me, you grow up in the America of the late 20th century, who are we kidding? I'm a black guy. And I think that probably reflects a reality. But the other reality is that I would say, for the best of reasons, racial categories are having trouble keeping up with new attitudes and new marriages. We, at the Pew Research Center, a year after he was elected, we did a survey. We asked people, what do you think? What do you think of Barack Obama? You think of him mainly as a mixed race person or mainly as a black person? A majority of whites said mainly mixed race. A majority of blacks said mainly black, but significant minorities of either group had it the other way. So this is one interesting challenge. I think our norms and our behaviors and our stigmas are changing, and it is clearly young adults in the next generation that is leading that change. Very briefly, the second big demographic change is we're getting older. As a population, we're getting older. 10,000 baby boomers, the famous generation born right after World War II, will turn 65 today. 10,000 will turn 65 tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and this goes on every single day until the year 2030, at which point the size of our 65 and over population will have doubled, and it will start to put stresses on our social safety nets for older folks, which were not built for that kind of age pyramid and demography. And they are unsustainable, and the people who run these programs year after year put out reports kind of blowing a bugle to everybody in Washington saying, hey guys, the math doesn't work, you know, we got a problem. It's 10 or 15 years down the road, but you can see it from here, because the one thing about demography is it is the future we already know, and these demographic trends are baked in. It's not just the United States that's becoming older. This is happening all over the world. There's the cover story in the current issue of The Economist has a cute cover line, "A billion shades of gray." The world's population of older people will double between now and mid-century, from about a half a billion to a billion. Overall, the population of the world the population growth has slowed down considerably. The world's population grew fourfold in the 20th century. It's probably only going to grow about another 50% this century. There are a lot of very attractive and likable trends going on here. It is that mortality is down and fertility is down. When I say mortality is down, it doesn't mean we're not going to die. Yes, I hate to say we are going to die, but mortality rates are down. People are living longer. It's happening all over the world. There are scientists working in labs who think they're going to beat this whole thing called death, and at some point we'll have little computer chips in the backs of our necks, or maybe Methuselah drugs that we will ingest, and just like an old jalopy with a good mechanic will just go on forever. You know, by the way, we did a survey on that, and we asked people, if you could live to be 120, would you like to? And actually, most people said no. But most people said most other people would want to. So that's another issue that we're sort of conflicted about. So we're getting older, we're getting more multiracial, and it is creating generation gaps. And let me talk a little bit now about generation gaps with a particular focus on our youngest generation, the so-called millennials. They were in our definition, and these boundaries are a little bit of a conceit. The idea that if you're 1 year older, you're in another generation is, you know, you got to draw the line somewhere. So we define millennials as young adults born after 1980. So the oldest of them is in his or her early 30s. And the youngest, you know, we don't know when that generation ends. Presumably, generations tend to last about 20 years. So presumably there are some teenagers who are going to be different from their big brothers and sisters. So who are these millennials, and what kind of path are they forging into adulthood? The answer is a very distinctive path into adulthood. Couple of D words I will string out quickly. They are the most racially and ethnically the most diverse generation in our history, and they are the transitional generation to when we become a majority non-white country. Indeed, all babies born today, more than half are non-white. This generation of young adults, about 43% or so, are non-white. Whereas the older generation, my generation and even older folks, 80% or so non-white. So you start with the racial and ethnic complexion of the of the old and young, and they are very different. Another distinctive thing about young adults is that they are detached from what I think somebody my age would describe as some of the core anchor institutions of society. Start with politics. They are a very distinctively liberal and democratic big D voting generation. They were a very important part of President Obama's 2 election victories. When we all do all sorts of questions about their social and political attitudes, they are very, very distinctively to the left of center across the board. Whether some of the social issues, the marijuana, gay rights, political issues, do you believe in government as a force for good, immigration reform, and all the rest. But if you ask them, do you identify as a Democrat, Republican, or independent, 50% say I'm independent. We've never seen any generation with that high a share saying I don't want to affiliate with any with any organized political party. I'm a free thinker. I don't want to attach myself. We see exactly the same pattern when we ask people about their religion. The United States is distinctive for all of the economically advanced countries in the world. The United States is the most religious in terms of affiliation, in terms of belief, in terms of practice. But in the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a rise in the number of adults of all ages who simply say, when you ask them, what religion are you, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, whatever it may be, a growing share of adults, very much led by the young, say, I'm not affiliated, I'm no religion in particular. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't believe in God, they don't pray, they don't have spiritual beliefs. They simply choose not to identify with organized religion. And about a third of millennials fall into that category. We've never seen these numbers that high. There is another anchor institution of society that millennials are not attached to, and that is a little thing called marriage, which has been around for, thousands and thousands of years in virtually every society in human history. And marriage in the modern era, not just in the United States, but through much of Europe in particular and other parts of the world, marriage is losing its customer base. It's a very striking phenomena. If you go back to 1960 and you just look, you took a current snapshot of all adults ages 18 and older, 72% of them would be married. Today, 51% of them are married. And again, the change once again is being driven by this young generation. So of millennials, of the 18 to 33-year-olds that I described today, only 26% are married. Average age of first marriage in the last 50 years has gone up for both men and women, gone up about 7 years. It used to be early 20s, now it's late 20s for both men and women. If you go to my generation, my darling wife is sitting right here, we got married when we were 21, which was somewhat par for the course about 150 years ago. The boomer generation at the same age, when they were that same age, about 55% of them were married. Even older folks, about 2/3 of them were married. So this is a really striking change because marriage is such a core institution. So again, we do surveys and we ask millennials who are not married, what's going on? You want to get married? And the great majority of them say yes. Yeah, I want to get married, plan to get married. And so I'm paraphrasing here. We don't quite do it this informative. I say, well, what's holding you back? And by and large, the predominant answer is economic. And in effect, what they are saying is, look at me, I'm not ready. I don't have a job. I'm still living with my parents, for crying out loud. Who the hell would want to marry me? I can't be a good provider. And so this is part of what growing up and what young adulthood is like for this generation. To somebody my age, what I would say is that they are getting to what I would call the traditional milestones of adulthood. You get a job, you start a career, you find a spouse, you buy a house, all boom, 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 boom. It is not happening yet for a lot of these young adults. And the clear reason, it seems to me, is economic. This generation, I mean, America, it's stopping, it's slowing down here. The rain is stopping. I keep on talking here. So listen, there is something called the American dream, and it has served us very well, and it speaks to a reality that has been part of this country for 200 plus years, which is the notion it always gets better, and the next generation always does better, and we believe in it, and it makes us feel good about our country, it makes us feel good about our kids. We are very optimistic people. That's not happening for this generation. Now, we don't know how their economic story ends, because they're still in their 20s and early 30s, but we know how their economic story has begun. And they have been dealt the worst hand in terms of an economy of any generation in modern history and perhaps history. Maybe you could argue that starting out during the Great Depression was a pretty tough time to start out. But I won't bore you with all of the statistics. But take it from me and go to our website and you can find all the numbers. Whatever economic indicator you like, whether it's employment rate, unemployment rate, average income, wealth, poverty, debt, and you compare the economic circumstances of today's young adults with the economic circumstances of older folks back when they were the age that today's young adults are now, and you do all the adjustments for inflation to make it a good, true apples-to-apples comparison, you will find that in every single one of those statistics, today's young adults are doing you're doing worse than yesterday's young adults were, doing worse than their parents' and grandparents' generation at the same stage of the life cycle. The reason is complicated. I'm not going to get it. I don't want to stretch my credentials. Clearly, there are just big, broad changes in the way global economies work. The globalization of labor markets, the technological revolution has made it more difficult. It is particularly difficult, and both the marriage story and the job story is particularly striking for young adults in that the income gaps by educational attainment have gotten very big. The kids who aren't marrying are at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. The kids who are having the worst time are at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. Now, the kids who are doing better, and I suspect a lot of you, the young adults here, have grown up with some privilege, have gone to college, and have sort of, quote, played by the rules and done it right, but you too are having a tough time. The phenomena of college loan, student loan debt has become a huge albatross around the necks of young people. It's another reason it's a little tough to get started and think about starting a family when you're paying off $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. So it is tough. It is tough if you go to school. It's even tougher if you don't go to college for young adults. Anyway, I've described some of the difficult circumstances of young adults, but let me describe a few other facets of their life that are fascinating and I think hold out hope for us all. Let's start with the question of, as I mentioned, they're unmoored from what I would think of as the traditional anchors of society. So how do they live their lives if they're not affiliating with and the answer, of course, is they live their lives through this little thing that we now all hold in our hands. They are the first generation of digital natives. So somebody my age struggles to adapt to the amazing things that we can all do here. And I've learned to adapt to them, but it literally boggles my mind that I can hold something in my hand and with 3 clicks I can gain access to, in effect, metaphorically, the sum of all human knowledge. And frankly, if it takes me a 3rd click, I'm thinking, what am I doing wrong here? For somebody who's 18, 25, 30, this is not mind-boggling. This is the only world that they have ever known. So this becomes not only their indispensable platform for information acquisition, but it has also becomes their indispensable platform for social interactions. They don't need to affiliate with traditional anchor institutions because they can create their own networks with the little thing they hold in their hand. Somebody more clever than me described millennials as our first modern pre-Copernican generation. And for those of you who don't remember your high school science, that means they think the universe really does revolve around them. And why wouldn't they think that? Because they have networks and they have social media, and they can not only create networks, they can attach themselves to networks that they're interested in, or they can build networks out from themselves. They can take pictures of themselves and selfies and whatnot, and selfies have actually had a very good run just in the last few months with Ellen DeGeneres at the Oscars and whatnot. Selfie was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2013. We did a survey actually a few weeks before Oscar night, and we asked adults of all ages, A, do you know what a selfie is? And B, have you ever taken a selfie and shared it on a social network site? And as you can imagine, there are enormous gaps here. So what's that? Not only had only 6% of older folks ever taken a selfie, but only about a third of older folks knew what a selfie was. So it is enormously empowering. It is a way you build networks. Some people have come to the conclusion, and I think wrongly have called millennials narcissistic. I mean, what do they go around? They spend their life taking pictures of themselves and showing off pictures of themselves. Is this any way to live? And I have two thoughts about that, which is, one is that no baby boomer should accuse anybody else of being self-involved and narcissistic. We have sort of retired the cup on that. We have been gazing at ourselves and celebrating ourselves. If you think about baby boomers for a second, we just think about our name. We became famous just for being born, for goodness sake. And we certainly became famous in the 60s when we were leaders of the kind of the counterculture revolution. And it was civil rights, and it was women's rights, and it was anti-war. And there was a lot of turbulence and a lot of turmoil. And there was an aspect of those times where there was kind of more than a whiff of generation war. There was a sense that as the boomers came of age, they looked with a disapproving gaze on all that their parents and grandparents had done. They said to themselves, you guys really screwed it all up. Thank God we're here to make it right. And so there was, one of the placards was never trust anybody over 30. Well, you can do a kind of a plus and minus takeaway on what the boomers achieved and didn't achieve, and I think it is a mixed bag. It's interesting, by the way, that the boomers were never quite as liberal as we remember them to be, because the noisiest of us, and my wife and I were pretty noisy, she more than me, made a big impression. It is a little known fact, just to stay with boomers for a second, that the first presidential election that boomers were old enough to vote in was 1972. That was the first election they lowered the voting age until 18. And more people in the baby boom cohort that year voted for President Nixon than for his anti-war challenger, George McGovern. So they were never quite as liberal as they were made out to be. And 30 or 40 years later, when we ask questions of people of all ages over the course of your lifetime, would you say you've gotten more conservative or more liberal? Most boomers say I've gotten more conservative. So they have taken an interesting life course. And now they are the parents of these millennials. And the millennials are not pointing an accusatory finger at the boomers, even though they have gotten, it seems to me, arguably a much worse deal, certainly in terms of their economic circumstances. One of the grace notes on our generational studies is when we look for visceral generational conflict, we don't find it much. To the contrary, what we find is a country where a greater share than ever, certainly than in the modern era, of generations are actually physically living under the same roof with each other. There are more than 50 million Americans now in multi-generational family households. And a lot of this is the boomers, is the millennials who simply can't get launched. They don't have jobs, they don't have careers, and it turns out mom and dad's house is a pretty good place to hang out for a while, and the refrigerator is usually stocked, and you don't have to put coins into the washing machine. But on top of that, they actually get along with their parents. And again, we've asked questions about this where we ask adults of all ages, did you have conflicts in your household when you were growing up? And older adults are much more likely to say yes about their own growing up experience than younger adults are. So you get a sense among millennials that they have somehow migrated from being the children of their parents to being the roommates of their parents, and they hang out and they text each other and they share their selfies, and and life is pretty good. I suspect most people believe that this is a phase that will pass, but there are cultures there are cultures where it doesn't pass, and Italy is famous for young men who live with their parents, particularly with their mothers, until they're 20, until they're 30, until they're 40. There's a phrase, an affectionate phrase, bamboccioni, big baby, or mamismo, mama's boy, and so some of this is cultural. There are other countries in Europe which also have very, very high youth unemployment rates, like we do, where the kids don't live. So there's a mix of cultural change and economic change going on here that has had the effect of slowing the passage into adulthood for these young adults. The last few points I would make are that despite their difficult economic circumstances, millennials are a play nicely with other generation. I think we all got that grade in kindergarten. I think millennials do very well on that. They are not a conflictual generation. They're not looking to pick a fight, not with each other, not with their parents. Interestingly, however, they are a somewhat wary generation about human nature. And here's a really interesting finding. It's a classic social science question we ask. It's about social trust, and it goes like this. Generally speaking, would you say most people can be trusted, or would you say you can't be too careful when you're dealing with other people? Millennials, only 19% of them say most people can be trusted. They are the least trusting generation, despite the fact that they play nicely with others. And it's a little bit of a paradoxical finding, but it does correlate with other things we know about social trust. Which is that, as I mentioned, a high share of them are minorities, and a high share of them aren't doing too well economically. And when it comes to social trust, we know that people who are vulnerable in society for whatever reason tend to have lower levels of social trust because they are less well fortified to deal with the consequences of misplaced trust. So that may be one explanation. I think another potential explanation goes to the way they were raised. They were raised with very protective and nurturing parenting norms. You're very precious. It's a mean world out there. Columbine, 9/11, school shootings, global terrorism. Watch out when you go online. There are predators out there. And I think they have gotten the message that you do need to be careful. And I think as they navigate their lives online, they find a lot of real friends, and they find a lot of people who turn out not to be who they say they are. So I think that's a potentially challenging situation, because at the end of the day, in any society, a social trust is sort of part of the grease that helps keep the gears from grinding. And there is awareness about this generation. The other thing about this generation is they are a very confident generation. You look at their economic circumstances and you say to yourself, boy, they must be pretty glum. And the answer is they're not. Again, we have measures from this. We can compare them to older adults. If you ask adults of all ages, do you have enough money to lead the life you want? Younger adults will say no. Older adults, the older you get, they will likely say yes. If you ask them, however, do you think you will eventually have enough? It is the younger adults who are far and away the most optimistic. There is something about the American experience that hasn't been lost on these young adults, which is they do believe in the future, and they do believe it will all work out. The last thing I would say is more of a political challenge, which is in order for it to all work out, we as a society need to rebalance that social safety net to make sure that the programs that keep the older folks in relatively good shape, Social Security and Medicare, the great programs of the 20th century that have created a world where it used to be the poorest people in our society were old people. Today, the poorest people in our society are young people. The good news here is that we have these two programs that without them, about half of all of our older folks would be poor. Because of them, only about 10% of our older folks are poor. They have worked magnificently. They are the most popular programs we have. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the math on these programs doesn't work because as all these boomers cross into old age, they go from being taxpayers to being beneficiaries, and the dependency ratio gets skewed. These programs are growing and growing and growing. They're now at about 50% of our budget. And you have for young adults, and we simply can't sustain them. And again, the actuaries of these programs say that by 2026, Medicare will be out of money, and by 2033, Social Security will be out of money, and then you have to do drastic cuts because you just don't have the money there. Millennials know this. It's really quite interesting. We asked millennials, do you think Social Security will be there in your retirement? And we gave people three options. It'll be there at current funding levels, it'll be there at reduced levels, it won't be there at all. 50% say it won't be there at all. 40% say, yeah, it'll be there, but at reduced level. Just 6% believe that those programs that are taking care of their parents and grandparents and that they are very grateful for, they don't want to see them cut, just 6% believe that they will be there for them. So we are, as a society, sort of imposing a kind of double whammy on these kids in that when they do get jobs, they are paying into a program, and again, a lot of them don't make much money. They don't make enough to pay much in taxes, but boy, the first dollar they make, they are paying into Social Security and Medicare. So they're paying into the first whammy is they're paying into a system to support a level of benefits that they themselves have no reasonable prospect of getting when they get old. And secondly, the growth of these programs is such that it is crowding out the kinds of investments that made the country great for most of us here. And we are doing many fewer of those investments. And again, this is a longer speech and a longer story, but both public and private investments in the things that made this country great. If you want to go to the Intercontinental Railroad or the interstate highway system or the internet, stuff that we do for ourselves, Erie Canal, Panama Canal, GI Bill, Marshall Plan, land grant colleges, these kinds of big things have always been a part of who we are. And they have always been a part of making things better for the future. That is, after all, the American dream. Every new generation is an arrow into the future. And my generation had a chance to soar because of the investments and the sacrifices that were made by people older than us. And my fear is that this generation will not have as good a chance to soar because those investments aren't being made and we haven't modernized the way we spend our money. This is a solvable problem. There's no magic to it. It takes political leadership. We don't have to get into the story of Washington, D.C. It's not working very well now, and they're having a lot of trouble grappling with this. But this, it seems to me, is the great challenge that we face, old and young alike, to make sure that tomorrow's America is as strong as today's. Thank you very much.